I've got a bit of a musical intro for you today.
Read the sign, bro!
I'm sorry. Sorry. I didn't read the sign. I was just thinking how many occult influences there are in rock and roll, and I really wish I had somebody to talk to about that. And it would be such a plus if that person also was an expert on the horn god and Greek mythology. Operator, connect me to Jason Mankey. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian, and today I'm talking to Jason Mankey. Jason is a high priest, a witch, and an author of more books than I could possibly tell you about in a single setting. In our house, at least, Jason's work takes up almost an entire bookshelf all to its own. Jason, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's only 9 books. I mean, it's not that many books.
Well,
it's like half a shelf, maybe. Half
a
shelf.
Half a
some
shelf.
Some of them are small. Some of them are small, so they only take up a little bit of space.
We have small shelves, though.
Okay, well, that's fair. Then it could be a whole space, a whole shelf.
So, to get started, would you tell me a little bit about how you kind of came across this path and got into witchcraft?
It's an interesting story because it has a bunch of starts and stops. When I was a kid, I was always really interested in cryptozoology, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and things like that. And if you are familiar with the Dewey Decimal System, the books on witches are right next door. And there's only like 6 books on Bigfoot at your local library, so I started reading the books next door. And I knew who Alex Sanders was, for instance, who's a pretty famous witch. By the time I was in 3rd or 4th grade, so it was pretty early. I also had a big interest in comparative religion. In the summer between my 7th and 8th grades, I checked out a book called Cast Your Own Spell by Sybil Leek from a local library. And I didn't read all of it, but I checked out a bunch of other books at the same time, and it was time to return those books. And I couldn't find one of the books that I needed to return, so I turned to Cast Your Own Spell and cast a spell, and I found the missing book within like a couple of seconds. You would think that would make me a witch, right? I'd be like, oh wow, this works, this is great. Instead, it scared the shit out of me, and I kind of put it away for a while, but I knew about it, which was nice. And then when I was 21, I came across a book called Celtic Magic by DJ Conway, which is a terrible book, by the way, just a terrible book. But DJ Conway is a very good writer and really sort of expressed witchcraft in a very accessible way. And at that point in my life, I was ready to embrace it and to do it, and I haven't looked back. Weirdly, I was president of my Methodist church youth group when I was in high school, so I've come a long way. Things have changed a lot.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely have a conservative Christian background as well. How did you move from that to initiatory witchcraft? Like, you had the Sybil Leek books and stuff like that, but how did you get into the tradition itself?
I was really fascinated by things like Janet and Stuart Farrar's Witch's Bible, or 8 Sabbaths for Witches and What Witches Do. It was originally 2 books and not 1. But most Americans know it as the Witch's Bible, and that's really sort of high Wiccan witchcraft, I summon, stir, and call you up kind of things. Maybe they weren't naked, but they were certainly all doing ritual and really cool robes and stuff. That sort of witchcraft really resonated with me. And it was the kind of witchcraft I really wanted to do. And my wife and I joined a Gardnerian outer court in like 2006, 2007, but we weren't really in a great place at the time. And we liked the people that we knew from there and became really good friends with them, but we didn't kind of go all the way through to be initiated. And then we had friends in that group who were initiates, And they told us in 2010, we want you to be our first initiates now that we're third degree Gardnerians. And we were like, sure, that would be great. They asked us right when I'd had surgery on my knee. So they told me, like, you might have to kneel at one point. And I was like, well, it's going to be several months before I can kneel. And so that happened, and then eventually we got initiated a few months later.
And then how did you work up to writing your first book and talking about it and becoming a lecturer? I remember at Summer Magick, you told me a little bit about, I think it was how you started writing and publishing your first book, if you would share a little bit on that.
I'd always wanted to be a writer. I tried to write a witchcraft book like 2005. I tried to write how do I say this? That sort of eventually became The Horned God of the Witches, which is a book I wrote that came out in 2021. But I've been doing a lot of speaking on the pagan circuit, going to a lot of festivals and doing workshops, and those were always very well received. And Christopher Penczak said to me once, he goes, you should write a book for Llewellyn. And he kind of made some introductions, and I sent them sort of what I had written at that point, which was about the Horned God, and they said, absolutely not, this is terrible. And they were right at the time, because writing is difficult, right? And it takes a while to become good at it. So I kind of put it on the back door for a while, moved to California in 2011 with my wife so she could take a job, and I had a lot of free time, and I started blogging. And in 2012, I became a blogger at Pathos Pagan, which at the time was a pretty big hub for people reading blogs. Remember blogs? It feels like something from 30 years ago now, but it was really only 4 or 5 years ago that they were still really popular. Anyway, I started blogging there, and I started writing 3 times a week, which is really what you need to do to be a good writer. You have to write a lot. It's not just something you can turn on or turn off. It's a lot like working out. You just can't run a marathon, right? You have to build up to it. And I think writing, and especially writing a book, is a lot like that. So I started blogging, and then in 2014, I got an email from Llewellyn, the same people who had turned down that earlier book, saying, would you write a book for us? We would like you to write a book about Athames or Athames, depending on how you say it wherever you live. And I did a little happy dance around my room, and I've been writing ever since. And I feel like my work gets better from book to book, that it's always improving, which is really nice.
I enjoy all your work. I had something I was going to show you, but I found it. Since I relocated, all my stuff is scattered around. Hold on one second. Let me grab it. See this card?
It's a little blurry.
It might be a little blurry. It says the next chapter. It has ink and a pen.
Yeah.
You sent me this card because I bought the last 2 prints of the Horned God cover.
Oh.
And you wrote in here, you feel like I should get a prize or something. But that the only prize, unfortunately, was this card. So I kept it because I'm a keeper of things like that. And I'm wondering what inspired you to write for the first time about the Horned God.
So, as I said before, that was the first time I'd ever tried to write a book. And I actually self-published a version of that many years ago. Oh. When I actually wrote Horned God of the Witches, I didn't use anything that was in this book. I started fresh. But, there are maybe a couple hundred people who have this floating around their house somewhere. But I wanted to write a Horned God book because there just aren't Horned God books, right? Certainly Llewellyn had never published a Horned God book before mine, and they really didn't publish any books about male deity at all, and just felt called to write it. My first real workshop at a lot of pagan festivals was a Horned God workshop. That was just sort of what I felt called to talk about. A lot of it stems from having very personal relationships with the gods Pan, Dionysus, and Cernunnos. 2 of them are certainly horned and or antlered deities. Dionysus maybe less so, but I include him there too because he sometimes took the form of a bull, and there's some phallic imagery with Dionysus too, so I think he fits in nicely. Anyway, I just felt called to talk about those gods, and I kind of abandoned the idea of writing a Horned God book because it's really hard. to write something like that. The horned god is sort of a combination of a lot of different deities. It's a big idea. It's not necessarily an idea that existed in antiquity. Certainly there were horned and antlered deities in antiquity, but the idea that there was this sort of one universal horned god was not really something that people believed back then. And so sort of write about all that history in a way to make it accessible and to not make it boring and to have rituals. I thought maybe that was beyond me. But there was one day in the shower where I like came up with an outline in my head. I was like, I think I can do this now. Like, I think I'm smart enough. And I ran back to my computer and sat there naked, sopping wet, started typing up the little bits that became the various chapters, and some of those changed over time, but a lot of that outline was what I sent to Llewellyn, and they were like, remember in 2005 when you tried to write this book? Because they kept all of that stuff. And they're like, yeah, that didn't turn out so well. Can you do this? We're not sure that we want you to do this. And I was like, come on, this will be my 8th book for you now. Like, things have really changed. Or 7th book, whatever. They all kind of blend in your head. But I mean, my writing's is improved a lot since 2005, and I'm really excited about this. And I got it through, and I got to write this book. But it's really a devotional act. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the Horned God book, and I think you're very right. It's often extremely difficult to find God centric writing within the tradition. And that definitely filled a lot of the gap for me. And I think you presented a lot of information, ritual, history, and personal experience that helped my practice a lot. I actually took your altar idea. I think it was a Cernunnos altar, but I made it a Pan altar.
Yeah.
So I've got, my statue of Pan, some stuff that I associate with Pan, like pan pipes and a candle and stuff. But in your personal experience, how did you, I think you wrote about this a little bit in one of your books, but how did you come to meet the horned god for the first time?
It was something that I was running from for a really long time. When I got involved with witchcraft, I wanted to do all goddess all the time. That was my focus. I wanted to be a goddess worshiper, and if I had to have a male deity, well, maybe he'd look like Apollo or something, right? Something pretty benign. It's hard to overcome that Christian conditioning, right? I mean, horns and antlers, devil, bad. And it took me a while to warm up to it. But there was this feeling that I had within myself, and it was really focused on Pan first out of all those deities. It was, you're going to have a relationship with me. You're going to worship me. You're going to do these things with me. And I always tell the story that I lived in this house in Lansing, Michigan, and we had these scrubby bushes in front of the house. And I would walk up to the house, and I'd look in the bushes, and I swear that there were these eyes just looking at me from the bushes. And they were Pan, and I would just try to get by them as quickly as I could so I didn't have to deal with him, because that's not the kind of God that I wanted to worship. And eventually my, defenses sort of fell down, there was just this incessant humming, Pan, Pan, acknowledge me, acknowledge me. And just saying his name was all the acknowledgement that I really needed to do, just saying it out loud in ritual, and just kind of felt this rush of energy sort of fall upon me. And I'd felt that before the first time I'd prayed to the goddess. I remember my first prayer as a witch. My grandmother had taught me a Christian prayer, and I'd said it every night before I went to bed. And it was like, Lord, keep us safe this night. And that night I said, Lord and Lady, keep us safe this night, and felt this rush of something. And that was the same with saying his name. And then kind of got into looking at the bigger idea of the horned god, and then particular deities made themselves known to me, most notably Cernunnos and Pan. And there are a few others which I think of as sort of horned and horny deities that didn't make this book. Shiva, I have a nice relationship with Shiva, and Kokopelli. His real name is actually Kukapolo, and he's a Hopi Kachina. But I didn't want to write about those in the book, just because of I don't honor them in Wiccan circles or witch circles. It's just more of sort of a personal thing off to the side. That was a lot of answers in one. That was a lot of
It gave me so
information.
many more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, do you think that your initial, I'll say, rejection of kind of the God aspect and your initial devotion to the goddess was kind of based on your previous life experience as, I think you said, a Methodist?
Absolutely. It was because, you grow up with that fear of the devil or that idea of the devil, and you associate horns and antlers with these sort of wicked things. And honoring that just seemed like a step too far, right? I mean, a god with goat legs and horns and doesn't really bathe a whole lot. That's not me. Blonde hair and going out in the sunshine. That's the kind of god that I wanted to worship, and that didn't really work out. It was meant to worship gods that are outdoors with things on their heads and sometimes with the legs of goats. But yeah, it's all that conditioning, you know. And I think too, and this isn't really your question, but I talk about it a lot in the book. The horn god as a bigger entity comes from a lot of different places and areas and a lot of different ideas. And some of those come from ideas of the folklore devil, sort of a trickster, sort of a god of, I don't want to say just debauchery, because I think that's too simplistic, but a god of enjoyment and of self, of having sex and having a nice dinner, right? Things, dancing, people in the early modern period were very much like, don't dance because that's the devil sort of thing, right? And you look at that folkloric devil from that period of time, and it's a god who wants you to be happy. It's not a god of misery or suffering, right? It's a figure that says enjoy life. And I think as a witch, we should enjoy life. And I think the horn god is sort of an invitation to enjoy life, an example of enjoying life, but enjoying it in a responsible, considerate, and compassionate way.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. And moving out a little bit from just the God perspective to kind of an entire pantheon perspective, I think you just wrote a book about an entire pantheon, didn't you?
I co-wrote a book about an entire pantheon. I co-wrote this book with Estrella Taylor, and her contributions are equal to mine, and it's in places are better. So, I want to throw out the name of my co-author, and I'm very lucky that I've gotten to co-write 3 books now with other people. But yeah, we just released that in December, Modern Witchcraft with the Greek Gods, and it's a lot of historical stuff and about working with the gods and rituals and spells to work with the gods. Really, really happy with how that book came out. Like, really overjoyed with how that book came out. The layout, the words, every bit about it, I think, is really terrific.
Well, I definitely enjoyed the fact that there's not only, good historical information in there, but there's also ritual and there's personal experience from a bunch of different people. And that's really fun
Yeah.
to read different people's experiences and encounters, like with Pan. I really enjoyed those as well. So, since the book is about Greek myth, I was curious if you have a favorite Greek myth that you'd like to share.
Wow, that's a pretty good question. A favorite myth? Probably my favorite is it's a story that appears in the Homeric hymns, and it's the story of baby Hermes. And I think it's hilarious, and I think it should be taken as hilarity because I think that's what it was meant to be. So Hermes is born, and he's a very smart young baby god, and he sees some cattle, and the cattle belong to Apollo, and he sacrifices one, and he sacrifices to the gods, including himself amongst that number before he's ever been on Mount Olympus. And then he decides that he's going to steal the entire herd of cows. And to make sure to sort of mask his tracks, he has the cows walk backwards, right? So Apollo's going to be getting further and further and further away as he tracks the cows. So eventually, Apollo sort of figures it out, and takes his brother, his little baby brother Hermes, before Zeus, And, Apollo's accusing him of these things, which are all true, of course. But Hermes' defense is, but I'm a baby. How could I do that? I'm a baby. And I just think that is hilariously funny. And then Hermes makes amends by kind of creating the lyre and giving that instrument to his brother, and everything is forgiven and everybody's happy and stuff. But the idea that this baby sacrifices to himself and counts himself among the Olympians shortly after birth, there's some really great hubris in that, which I think is amazing. And then the prank of stealing the cows and making them walk backwards, and then of course saying I'm a baby, I'm a baby, I'm a baby over and over to Zeus is just riotously funny to me.
I think that one is definitely towards the top of my list, but my number one favorite story is where Orpheus battles the sirens musically. I mean, it's not really a battle, but they're sailing past the sirens, and he sings and plays to compete with their singing to lure the Argonauts into the water. And I just kind of picture that like an epic Star Wars battle where if you replaced the blasters with musical instruments and you put it in ancient times, that's what was going on during that.
There's also a story where Zeus and one of his sons comes down to Earth, and they meet an old couple who are very nice to them and treat them very well, while most everybody else had been inhospitable to them. And it was clear that the couple really loved each other. And when they died, they just turned into trees, and so they would be next to each other and with each other for eternity. And that's one of my goals, is to turn into trees with my wife. That's high on our list.
Aw. That's a lovely goal.
Yeah.
I like it. So, if we're talking about myth, makes me think of history, of course. I know you're really big into history, and I was wondering what your opinion is on how we can best preserve the craft as we move forward today.
We do a terrible job of preserving our history. An absolute disgrace of a job. I mean, there's been pagan music out since the 70s. Most of it is unavailable except some really bad recordings on YouTube. I mean, it's terrible. Most pagan periodicals you cannot find copies of anymore, right? They exist in some libraries on microfilm. Nobody uses microfilm, right? We don't have a digital archive of things. We're to an age now where a lot of the first and second and even third generation pagans from the United States are starting to pass away, and we haven't preserved their stories. So to me, I think what we really need to do is we need to sort of collectively decide that we're going to preserve some of these things. But in our local communities, we need to talk to people. We need to get people's stories down. We need to preserve them. We need to record them, and we need to write about them. And we need to share these names. There are so many people who've had a huge impact on our local communities, whether they ran rituals or organized events or taught classes or whatever it was. A lot of these people did that for 20, 30, 40 years. And maybe they never wrote a Llewellyn book, but they were as knowledgeable as anybody else, if not more so, and were really instrumental to creating community in various spaces. And I think we're losing those stories. And I think we're losing those stories because we're just not paying attention to these people, and we're not asking the questions that need to be asked. And I don't know how to fix it. I mean, one of the problems, I think, with the magical community is it's very decentralized, right? There's not one person who can really galvanize 40,000 different pagans and witches into action, right? I wish I had that kind of power to say, hey, we should digitize our archives. That's going to cost us $60,000-$70,000 because it's going to cost a lot of money. It's very tedious work to take microfilm and turn it into a digital file, and you have to pay somebody to do that. But we need to do that, and I'm not sure how we get it done. Maybe it doesn't get done, which would be a real shame, because we would lose so much of our history and the names that go with that history. And the evolution of thought in our community. Go back if you can find them, and most people can't. I happen to live near a university that has some of these archives of pagan periodicals going back to the mid 60s. We don't think about pagan periodicals going back to the mid 60s, but they did. And if you read those things, you can sort of see the evolution of ritual as it gets published in these newsletters and how much better it gets over time and how much thought people put into what they're doing. And you sort of see the evolution of acceptance of the GLBTQ plus community and things. And yeah, I don't want to lose that, but I really worry that we might. The preserving of history is a passion of mine, and one of the reasons I write so much about history, because I think it's important to know where we came from and to honor those people who got us there. And I'm really terrified that we're going to lose just a great deal of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the preservation of the history of the craft will come from listening to those personal stories of the elders. And yes, it's a shame we can't get them all written down, but I've noticed that when I go to, say, like a pagan festival or something like that, you can just sit down in a circle of people, and if you just listen, you start to hear the most interesting stories from like 30, 40 years ago, and that you never had any idea that these people are interacting or the things that they're doing, and they just come up in normal conversation if you pay attention. But would you say that like there's any particular places that are worth visiting? I know you've been to the Witchcraft Museum, right? You've done some research over there as well.
There's two witchcraft museums. There's the one in Boscastle, England, which is really awesome. That was started by Cecil Williamson, who worked with Gerald Gardner on a museum once, and then they had a falling out. And what's in Boscastle is Cecil's collection, and now it's in different hands. So that's a really cool one, though Boscastle is difficult for most people to go to, even if they live in the UK, because it's in the middle of nowhere, really. But then in Cleveland, Ohio, there's the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. And that has a lot of Raymond Buckland's personal artifacts, but also has things from contemporary witches and from other places and stuff. Stephen Innermill, who runs that museum, is actually a museum curator. He's not just, some guy who decided, hey, I'm going to have a museum. He used to run the Christmas Story Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, for those of us who love that movie, about shooting your eye out and all that. He has a background in running museums, and the museum is terrific. It's not particularly big. It's not going to take you 4 hours to go through, but you're going to see a lot of really cool witchcraft history there. So I think people like Stephen are preserving a lot of our history, and people now just send him things like old periodicals and stuff because they think that, as a museum, he's in a position to preserve some of that. And he probably is. But, he has limited resources, too. About history, though, too, I see more and more festivals recording workshops and things, which is nice. And sometimes it's just people who have been doing this for a while talking about their experiences. So we have those as audio files so people can go back and listen to them later, or access them online and things. So we are sort of making some headway in some ways.
Yeah, I hope that we're able to make a little bit more progress there and capture more of the stories before it's too late to get it from these people, because those experiences are a significant portion of our craft history. So, jumping topics a little bit, you run 2 covens, is that correct?
Yeah.
So, what is the difference between each?
So, when we moved to California, my wife works in the medical field, and we tried to go to other covens locally in our area. We live in the Bay Area of California, and there were a couple, but my wife was on call working in the medical field, and it was really hard to go to other places because a lot of times she was kind of stuck at home, needing to be near her computer in case she had to do work or she had to go into work, right? So we were kind of limited in how often we could go out, and what we needed access to at all times and things. So we decided maybe we should just invite some people over and do ritual ourselves. So that's what we did. Starting our second year of living in California, we invited some friends over, and we just called it a circle. We're just going to circle together. We're going to have rituals. It's not going to be a big deal. And I remember within 4 or 5 months, I think we started in February, March, and then by early autumn, I kind of looked into my living room one day, and then we had these people, who would all come to do circle with us, and they would come every time we did circle, and they would talk to each other, and they looked forward to being with each other, and they were excited about doing stuff. And I looked at my wife, and I was like, we have a coven. Right? I mean, it was something that was just beyond we're friends circling, right? This is love and trust, and to me that's really important in covens. And one of our friends, he said he never wanted to be in a coven. It was like a thing, circling was fine. He loved people, but he didn't ever want to be in a coven. So at Yule that year, we decided that we would sort of write down our ritual order, kind of like a little booklet, and we would give it to everybody in our group. And we live on a street called Oak Court, right? Like Circle Drive. Oak Court is where we live. And people would say, I'm going to Oak Court, when they would come over to our house to do ritual. So we decided when we made this little pamphlet, it said Oak Court Coven, right? Because that's what we were, and that was our name, because that was what everybody was using. And it sounds cool anyways, a little pretentious, but it sounds cool. And we passed that out, and my friend who didn't want to be in a coven, he's like, I'm in a coven, and everybody was cool with it. And so that was the beginning of our coven, and it's an eclectic coven. The ritual is basically what I've written. We do whatever it is that we want to do. It's not tied into any particular tradition. Very much influenced by the witchcraft of like Janet and Stuart Farrar and things, though, because that's the sort of language I like to use, and it's what the language my wife likes too. So that's our first coven. And then we were initiated into the Gardnerian craft before we left for California, went back to Michigan where we were initiated, elevated to second, third degrees, and then began a Gardnerian coven. Our Oak Court is not an outer court, but a lot of people who are Gardnerian came from that particular circle because they're people that we like. But there are people in that circle who don't want to be Gardnerians too, and we like that. So it's good to have two different ways of doing ritual and experiencing things.
I agree with you, and I think a lot of covens historically kind of got their name from their location. It was just kind of like an automatic naming thing. Do you still get seekers to both of the covens?
Yeah, we still do. One of the things, we moved to California, and we were expecting this very vibrant witch scene. And it is in other parts of the Bay Area, but we live in what's called the South Bay, near San Jose, which is Silicon Valley. And maybe it's because of the jobs that people have here and whatever, or perhaps the extremely high cost of living. There are less witches here than we thought there would be, that's for sure. Which is kind of sad, but I mean, you only have to go another hour or two to find higher concentrations of witches.
Well, how do you usually handle seekers to your group?
Really gingerly. Even the eclectic coven, there's a screening process. We want to make sure that the people who are in the coven are comfortable with us, and that we're comfortable with them, that they're going to fit in with what we do. Most of us are theists, right? We believe in the reality of deity. We had an atheist in our coven for a while once, and it just didn't work. I mean, she left on her own accord. We didn't kick her out or anything like that. But when we would, do a drawing down or something, you could just feel the skepticism oozing off of her, right? And I think she knew that and sort of left. So we want to make sure that the people that we circle with are compatible with what we do and with everybody else. So usually it involves me going out for coffee and stuff with people and, just seeing how they are and having conversations. Sometimes we vote on it do you have an objection, especially if it's somebody who's been in our community for a while, because people have histories, right? We had a really famous pagan person asked to join our coven once, and one of our coven members just didn't like this person, and we're like, if that person joins, I'm gonna leave, and I had to tell this really famous pagan, nope, can't do it. you know, uh, just not going to work out. So making sure that anybody we bring in is really cool with the other people in our coven is really important.
The group unity is definitely a huge thing. We follow a similar process with our seekers, questions, initial phone calls, coffee. We have a particular Starbucks we usually go to with everybody.
Yeah.
Um, since you mentioned drawing down, the last workshop I saw you give was at Summer Magic, and you talked about that a lot. And it was a great workshop. And I was wondering if you had, it's such a big hurdle to get over for a lot of people. I was wondering if you had any advice for people on how to initially get started with a task like that.
I think it's important to know who you're calling. I think it's important to know the deity that you're asking to be in circle with you. I think when we're starting out, it's like, oh, we're going to draw down the goddess, but not really thinking about it like the goddess. Okay, that's one thing. What do you expect to show up? What season is this? What kind of energy are you going to bring in? Are you prepared for that? Do you have a relationship with this figure that you're about to bring into the circle? And to me, that's the most important thing. Like, you don't call people that you don't know. Why would you ask a deity to inhabit your body, which is an extremely personal thing, without knowing them? So to me, the first step is to know the deity that you're going to call, that you're going to draw down. And hopefully you've probably already worked on this relationship before, right? Tonight we're going to do a ritual about wine, and we're going to draw down Dionysus. And I've been worshiping Dionysus for a year and giving Dionysus libations, and I've read Dionysus myths, and I've played a lot of music by the Doors. I am ready for Dionysus, right? And I think that's the first step, right? That's how you are successful at this. After that, though, part of it is learning to let go. Some people are really good at that. Some people are not particularly good at that. Some people don't want to cede control of their body to a deity, and they may think that they want to, but when push comes to shove, it's really hard to let go. I was in a circle once, and the person doing the drawing down was somebody who had trouble letting go. Serious job, pretty serious person, wasn't sure if they really wanted to have deity drawn down into them, but they were trying for the point of the ritual, and they started speaking in the third person during the ritual. We think this, we think that. And when they came back from the drawing down, they had no recollection of speaking about themselves in, like, what is that, like in a plural tense, right? And I was like, well, you did draw down, but you kind of fought it for a while, and maybe the two of you came to some sort of accord, but it was obvious to us that there was this two energies within you, your own and somebody else's, which is why you spoke as we. And they were like, wow, I did that, right? So sort of learning to give up yourself can be really hard for some people, but I think it's important. And one of the other things I think is really the most important with drawing down the moon is drawing down the moon is not for you, it's for the people that you circle with. It's not a parlor trick, it's not to impress people, it's to provide an experience for the people that you're having a ritual with. A chance for them to know deity, to speak with deity, to touch deity, to have deity whisper in their ear. That is a real blessing, a real power, and a real magic. And there are so many other spiritual traditions who offer nothing like that. The immediacy of being in a circle with deity, to me, it just makes me shiver thinking about it, because it's the coolest thing. And it's very awe-inspiring. There's a part of me that's still scared of it. I always think the goddess is going to point fingers at me, and call me out. or lack of belief when I was younger or something.
Yeah, I mean that is probably one of the larger reasons why coven dynamics and relationships are so important. And on a certain level, you do have to be choosy with the people that you let in your circle, because when you do something like drawing down, one person's energy can completely destroy the flow of energy while that's going on. But I think your first point as to get to know your deity is absolutely vital, and you definitely have to establish that relationship before you invite them to come and inhabit your body. So I appreciate you sharing that wisdom. I think all of that's very important to the process. And since you mentioned music and listening to the Doors, I have always read in your bio that you are, you know, very big into occult influences on music. So I was curious if you could share a little on that line.
So, one of the reasons I got into witchcraft and paganism was because of the band Led Zeppelin, right? I mean, there are many entrance ways into this world. Some people read the Mists of Avalon, some people stumble into the right book. I got into it really because of Led Zeppelin. There are a couple of factors there. Of course, there's Jimmy Page, the guitarist of Led Zeppelin, who has one of the largest collections of Aleister Crowley artifacts in the world and was a practicing Thelemite for years. At least that's what people tell me. The second is Robert Plant, who was always very interested in Celtic mythology, and that comes through in some of the lyrics of Led Zeppelin songs. So when I discovered the book Celtic Magick by DJ Conway, which I talked about earlier, I only bought it because I thought it might lead to further understandings of the lyrics of Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin. So, that Led Zeppelin was this gateway. But if you look at the music of Led Zeppelin, there's little occult influences here and there. On their third album, Led Zeppelin 3, and the first pressing of the LP, the wax has "Do What Thou Wilt Shall Be the Whole of the Law" carved into it. There are people who think that the figure on Led Zeppelin 4 resembles the alleged cunning man George Pickengill, who has been linked to witchcraft, erroneously in my opinion, over the last 40 or 50 years. So there's kind of a world there. And then, of course, there's bands like Black Sabbath, too, that people have always accused of devil worship. Is there devil worship in Black Sabbath? No, not really. There's some very Christian songs in Black Sabbath, actually, but some of them did dabble in the occult when they were younger. There are bands like Coven, which was an American rock band that were openly Satan worshipers in the late 1960s. I think their first album is called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls, and it's not very heavy metal sounding at all. I mean, that's kind of what you think it will sound like, and it really sounds like Harper Valley PTA, right? It has this very 60s sort of pop vibe to it. But yeah, there's a lot of occult influence, though, in music. People like David Bowie were into the occult. Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates was a practicing Thelemite and recorded an entire album about the Lima. So there's something about magic that I think attracts rock stars. But also, I think to be a rock star, and I mean, a lot of our rock stars today are rappers, are hip hop artists, and Jay-Z has been seen with some Crowleyana on some of his shirts before, too. There's kind of a chemistry and a magic there and a charisma to these people, which I think is related to magical practice. You know.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Led Zeppelin, because for some reason before the interview, something told me to put on this Led Zeppelin shirt, which you probably can't see because the video is a little grainy. But, a
I see the
message
blimp.
received.
I see that. I see the blimp there. Yeah. I used to do workshops called, there was two. I did Led Zeppelin in the occult and heavy metal in the occult. And when I went to festivals, I had the big slideshow with all the images of these bands. and would sort of share the history of some of these things. And in the case of Led Zeppelin, I focused really a lot on them and the art on the LPs and some of the lyrics and some of the things that Jimmy has said over the years, which was really fun. And played little snippets of music. In the Led Zeppelin one, I used to play a little bit of Stairway to Heaven backwards. In the early 80s, that was a big deal. People thought that if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, you can hear Here's to My Sweet Satan. And if somebody primes you for that and says, this is what you're going to hear Here's to My Sweet Satan. But it's really just sort of kind of an accident. It's just what it sounds like when you play it backwards. There's no like subliminal message put into the track. And then I did heavy metal and the occult too, playing lots of little heavy metal songs and things. And those were really fun to do at festivals because you just don't get to play heavy metal at pagan festivals and gatherings, right? It's always kind of more folky stuff, and being able to go like, here's some Sabbath, I think is really cool and really fun, and like now we're gonna play some King Diamond, some Megadeth. I love that stuff. So it's really good for me. So those workshops were fun, but they were a lot of work to put together. So I don't do them very often anymore.
Well, I wish I could have attended one, and if you do another one in the future, please let me know because I'd love to come and see it. I'm wondering, do you think that the occult influences in music were heavier or more prevalent during the 70s or 80s than they are now?
That's a good question. I mean, today, music goes in cycles, like of what's popular and things, so like heavy metal and hard rock were a lot more popular in the 70s. And certainly bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath had those bits in their music, but a lot of occult has always been window dressing, right? A lot of people use occult imagery in music, but really aren't practicing occultists themselves. I think there's as much as ever, but it's just not in the mainstream. There's a lot of really great bands who use occult imagery. I think the most successful the last 10 or 12 years is the band Ghost from Sweden. They headline arenas now in the United States, which I think is really amazing. I love Ghost. And, the shtick is that they're Satan worshipers trying to spread the satanic gospels, around the world. And there's lyrics that reference occult things and ideas, but it's really more lip service than like a practice for a lot of these people. The band Blood Ceremony is another one, and the bands are out there and they exist, but they're just not in the mainstream in the way that Led Zeppelin used to be. I did mention Jay-Z, though, who has been connected to Thelema in the past, and Jay-Z's not on the radio anymore, but he's a billionaire and created an empire, and his wife's Beyonce. So there's probably something to all that, So maybe it's still there. It's just a little bit more hidden than it used to be.
Okay. Well, I think we're getting a little bit late in the time, and I don't want to keep you in case you have some other engagements later on in the day. So in just a second, I'm going to hit you with the Music, Myth, and Magic signature question.
Uh-oh.
But before that, I just want to ask you, how can people find you, and are you into anything right now that people should be aware of?
Right now I'm writing a biography of Raymond Buckland, who was the first modern public witch really in the United States. He was the first Gardnerian initiate. He was British, but he moved to the United States. He was English and moved to the United States in the early 60s. So that's been a long project, and I think it's maybe 2/3 done, which is good. And so that'll be out in another year or so. I'm really easy to find online there. I think there are only 4 Jason Mankeys in the entire United States. One of them, sadly, is a Christian preacher. I'm sure he does not enjoy me at the top of the search results, hogging all the Google space. So I'm easy to find. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, and the platform formerly known as Twitter, at least for now. Maybe not for much longer.
Okay, well, I will post your social links and a link to some of my favorite books of yours in the video description. So if anybody's watching, they just want to click, they'll go right to your profiles. So, Jason, here is the signature question. How do you use sound or music in your personal magical practice?
So I think music is one of the best ways to create a vibe or an energy. Like if you're doing ritual, to me, if I put on the Doors, I am transported into ritual space nearly immediately. If I turn on Led Zeppelin's Battle of Evermore, I am transported into ritual space immediately. Music has this power to dredge up emotions and feelings, to put you in a mood for things, but I think it's even greater than that. I think about the music that we listen to in the spring. It's sometimes different than the music we listen to in the summer. Especially at Yuletide, we might listen to songs that we loved as children or other things. And at Samhain season, we listen to different music, right? I mean, I have autumn playlists, spring playlists, summer playlists, early fall playlist, late autumn playlist, Yule playlist. And the music connects me to the wheel of the year just as viscerally as going outside, right? There's that transformative power of music. When I want to create certain moods in ritual with my coven, we play certain songs. As Samhain, we do a big ritual sometimes in some of the bigger community groups with the idea that you're going to reunite with your beloved dead. And we don't want silence in the background, so we play certain songs like Fairport Conventions, Who Knows Where the Time Goes, maybe some Lorena McKennitt in there too. And it adds to the atmosphere of what you're doing. And when you add to the atmosphere and can get this part of your brain turned off that's analytical, you open yourself up to spiritual experiences. And music, I think, facilitates that.
I love that you said that music connects you to the wheel of the year, because that's exactly what I was just thinking when you were talking about having your summer and your spring playlist, because there's a different energy when you're in these different seasons, and music absolutely is going to help transport your consciousness to connect to that spiritual vibe.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes maybe it's just a song that we heard at a particular season. Sometimes maybe the song is about the season. At this point in the year, like Sting's Fields of Gold is always like stuck into my brain, right? And, in a couple of more months, and I'm like 60 days is when I start listening to Christmas carols again. All of a sudden I'm going to have the Carol of the Bells stuck in my brain, and I'm looking forward to it. But it tells me where I am on the wheel of the year. It connects me to those energies. I mean, the wheel of the year is about nature, of course, but it's also, I think, about shared memories, folklore and customs that we have, that we celebrate throughout the year, and music connects us to those.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. I appreciate you sharing that with us, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here on the show with me. Are you doing any festivals or workshops anytime soon?
The next couple of months, this is almost a quiet time for presenters and stuff, but I will be at the Gathering of Souls, which is outside of Memphis, Tennessee, in the middle of October, though I think registration for that ends soon. And then I will be at Pagan Pride in Las Vegas, the 11th of November. And then next year, there's Sacred Space, there's Convocation, there's Paganicon, there's Phoenix Rising in Florida. There's a lot of festivals on the agenda next year. So Puff Pagan Unity Festival next year. So there are things coming down the horizon, that's for sure.
Okay. I will grab some of those links and post them in the video description as well. Other than that, Jason, I really appreciate you being here again. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the call now so you can get moving on with whatever else you have planned today. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Wow. What an interview. I'm going to take that information and summarize it in article form. I'll put the link in the video description below. That way, if you're looking for Jason's social profiles, the books he's written, or some of the events he'll be at in the future, all you have to do is click and everything will be right there for you. I'll be talking to other interesting people soon. Please make sure you subscribe here on YouTube so that when I put out content, you get the latest updates. You can also follow me on Facebook at Eric Arcadian. If you'd like to help support me making videos, you can also check out my Patreon page. The link will be in the video description below. Now, I feel inspired, so I'm going to take us out. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.